everyone look at the positive good theory. Actual the paragraph of the positive good theory. So this is written 2 years later. For whatever reason, I didn't put down the date, but this is 1846. So he is refining his ideas to civilize slaves. And if they don't civilize them, what will they resort to? Vice or savagery? What's the other one? I told you they might become one. Well, they might turn to cannibalism. Or they're like what? Children. Yeah, like little children who can't, which they kind of go together. They're little children, so they can't control their impulses, implying that adults can. And so look at the positive good theory. He's refined this. But if you read this, if you go down a little bit further, right where the fourth line, right in the middle, it says, "I hold then that there never has yet existed a wealthy and civilized society in which one portion of the community did not, in point of fact, live on the labor of another." And so part of the positive good theory is that it's saying that it's natural that there's always been a group on top and then a group on the bottom that labors for them. By the way, what group was the author in? On top. So he is writing this not to people who are either on top or think someday they might get on top. Someday you can get a slave and get on top. And so let me read a little bit further. "I may say with truth that in few countries, so much is left to share of the laborer, so little exacted from him. It's so easy being a slave. You don't have to do anything. Where there is more kind of pension paid to him in sickness or infirmities of age. Slaves are cared for from the moment they're born until the day they die. They're cared for and nurtured and loved." That's what he is saying, which, as we all know, is very much true about slavery. "Compare his condition with the tenants of the poorhouses in the more civilized portions of Europe." He's talking about the North. "Look at the sick and the old and the infirm slave on one hand, in the midst of his family and friends, under the kind superintending care of his master and mistress." So if they're sick, the master and mistress come and care of them. Otherwise, is that true? Absolutely not. It's absolutely ridiculous. Compare that with the forlorn and wretched conditions of the pauper in the poorhouse. When he's talking about the pauper in the poorhouse, he's not talking about chattel slavery. He's talking about what kind of slavery? He's talking about wage slaves. And that's what's being created in the North, wage slaves. And I think I mentioned this right when the bell rang. So this shows the wretched condition of these wage slaves right here, compared to the happy slaves in the natural condition where the relationship is maintained and there are very few deaf, dumb, blind, insane idiots. And that's how they treat here. But this is the important thing. And this is what is implied throughout the positive good theory of slavery. This is natural. This is unnatural. And partially because they divided everything by color and skin. They're treating white workers like this. Treating white workers. And what will white workers do eventually if you treat white workers like that? Slave rebellion. Well, it won't be a slave rebellion, but it'll be a rebellion. And that's what you have to get. The condition of this new capitalistic system that's happened in the North will lead to rebellion. Whites will not take it because whites aren't supposed to be treated that way. Remember, this is intensely racist. They will not be treated that way, and they will rebel. And what system do you want in the West? One that will lead to rebellion, that will lead to civil war, or one where everybody knows their place, and as you can tell, life is sweet and pure. And that was the positive good theory of slavery. It was more than just civilizing. It was, we are protecting the natural order. And what's going on where there's wage slaves will lead to rebellion. Now, don't forget, the greatest fear of slave owners is slave rebellion. How do you have slave rebellion if slavery is so fun? Who do they blame it on? Who are the evildoers I mentioned once before trying to go against the unnatural order because they hate the owners? Because abolitionists are spreading their material, and slaves were perfectly happy until abolitionists started spreading what they said. Slaves always liked slavery. Now, of course, this is not true. What do you call a strongly held belief? your ideology. And they will spend their entire time looking for confirmation of their ideology. And let's say you disagree with them. What does that say about them? If you disagree with them on their ideology, what do they think about you? You're what? Huh? Not just wrong. You're the enemy. You catch that point? It's more than just a disagreement. You're the enemy. You're the one trying to cut my throat in the middle of the night. I should add, this is a view that people have clearly all over the United States and other places today. And it's kind of scary. We are very unstable right now. That is amazing. When I was talking about a martial law in a country that just happened, and Alex pointed out there's massive civil war basically in Georgia. And this is happening. Syria is about ready to go into complete flames. Turkey, there's a chance of rebellion right now in Turkey. Because that's always kind of happened in Turkey for the last 4 years. Yeah, everything's politics. It's the entire world. But I mean, there was essentially an attempted coup in Turkey 3 years ago. And so the point is, it's kind of worldwide. In the United States, we are all over the place. Yay. Moving on. So this is where we get something known after the Civil War, become known as the Gone with the Wind. Who's ever heard of Gone with the Wind? Has anyone ever seen the movie? You got 4.5 hours to spend. It's a movie about the Old South, made in 1938. It was one of the first movies that was in color. It's a classic movie, but it tries to portray the South as this place where the slaves love slavery. The heroes of the movie are the masters and mistresses, the owners of the slaves. The villains, the North, the Union Army, Abraham Lincoln. They're the villains. And this was an international bestseller in the early 1920s. And so it just became synonymous with the myth. If you go to the South and go to some of these plantation homes, they'll talk about the old plantation home. Look how happy it is. Plantation home got a steamboat, just lounging, doing nothing. Slavery. And this was the idealized South. This idealized South, and this is the definition of, I told you this before, like a romanticized South. And it's very, by definition, conservative. And so it's going to look at themselves and their past, not the way it was, but the way they want to like it to be that way. And so once again, foundational, and look at the slave quarters, curtains, and once again, got to be playing the banjo. There are so many pictures. That's a lithograph in the 1850s. And so that's why the South called it, the Southern plantation owners called it the peculiar institution. It's not slavery. It's not a brutal system of torture and coercion. It's just their peculiar institution. Here's another singing and dancing from the 1850s. But this myth, and it's a myth, is very, very alive today. So that is a kid's book that was sold as in Mount Vernon, still is. And it's a birthday cake for George Washington. And look at the happy, chef. She's cooking with her daughter. And they're making a cake for George Washington. This is at Mount Vernon, George Washington's home. And they're just very happy to make the cake for George Washington. And talks about their life and how pleasant it is. What are they? They're slaves. That is a myth. So, what we really have here is basically proto-capitalism. Early capitalism, the early system of capitalism that would be personified in the South. And remember, capitalism is where a market economy, where the means of production, the machines, are owned by a few individuals. Once that happened, it changed the world. Well, the capital are humans, and they're owned by a few individuals. And that is where you get basically the whole system of the South. More slaves, more wealth. And that, how you made it, I had a slave. But one more thing. This shows the value of slave. And this is in $2,000. There's always inflation. Here, 1820s, the first industrial revolution, the first hit of Britain. The demand for cotton spiked, demand for slaves spiked. And it's also right after the banning of the international slave trade. Here, just before the 1837 panic, and that is the first textile mills in the United States. Here, the big boom in the 1850s. I should add, this is right before the Civil War. See the price of slaves dropping? Think about insecurity of slaveholders. See the price of slave dropping. That is right before they seceded. So much insecurity in the system. One more thing. Scale. Economies of scale. The bigger the plantation, the competitive advantage. So remember, 0.1% of slave owners own the majority of slaves. And those are two different versions of cotton baskets. Eventually they have these big canvas bags they would drag behind. And this is important to see. Overseers. Overseers are almost always slaves. Slaves would be the overseers of other slaves. 99% of the time. And children would go out in the field with them. But how did it function? So, it functioned, this proto-capitalism, this happens in a lot of places, but it's called the slave labor camps, use what's called the pushing or the quota system. Push, push, push. So I remember being first heard about slavery, first heard about this in the United States, and you can imagine kind of an elementary school version, which I bet is not a lot different than what you guys might have had in elementary school. And I had this vision of enslaved people working with somebody whipping and beating them to work harder and harder and harder. That's what I envisioned. This work, work, work. And that's not at all the way slavery functioned. Not just in the United States, any place else. That is incredibly inefficient. I mean, if the only way you're going to get someone to work is sit there and whip them, it won't work. As soon as you turn it back, you're quit. And so what they do is, let's say there's a slave on this domestic slave trade. It's horrible. Remember I told them coffees. From Virginia, where there was a surplus of slaves, and they were sent downriver. So let's say to the Yazoo Delta right here to work on one of these horrible cotton plantations. And they would get there, be weak from the trip, and they would give them a week rest. And they'd probably have the best food they're ever going to have. Proteins. There's always going to be a lack of protein. So, best meal, rest. And they would take a couple days and go out in the field. So let's say it's cotton picking season. This is for every work they do, for cotton picking. And they would watch and practice to see how they do it. And then they would go out there for the first day. First day. And they were good shape, and they would pick cotton. Pick in the basket, it's in the bag, and they would weigh it. And at the end of the day, they come up with a number, aka your quota. Make sense? And that would be your quota. And that would set it. So they would set the quota. And then what does that mean? Every day afterwards, you have to meet that quota. And if you don't meet the quota, what happens to you? You're tortured. Torture. Meet the quota, torture. That's it. And actually, slave owners they really would push this idea. I don't beat my slaves. Oh, sure, if they don't meet their quota, there's consequences, but I don't just rip them. But they will have to meet. There will be consequences for failing to meet their quota. And don't forget, they're the healthiest they'll ever be when they meet that quota. Every day they get weaker. And if they meet the quota 2 days in a row, what do? They push it up. So you got to meet a higher quota. Meet a higher quota. Doesn't matter if you're sick, doesn't matter the weather, you got to meet that. And if you don't meet that, you're tortured. And so all elaborate tortures. Usually whipping, but torture. And for some reason, that's even more terrifying than the incorrect version of slavery. Because they're not watching you. They know. You don't meet it, you're tortured. That's it. It's just the way it is. You take a break. All right, take your break. You're going to be tortured. I'm sorry. Just lightly, just a little bit of a, reminder. And so they had incentives to increase productivity. So they had to figure out ways to work faster, to be more efficient, to work harder in the same amount of time, to produce more. And so productivity went up. They got more work per slave because of the incentive was you're going to be beaten if you don't. That's why slavery has always existed, always. But it was obviously really quite effective here, quite effective for the slave owners. And the whole thing is terror. Whole thing based on terror. And that quota became the biggest terror of all. That quota was like this never-ending number they couldn't escape from. They couldn't escape from that. And the older you got, it didn't matter. And I should add, as soon as you can walk, you got a quota. As soon as you can walk, you got a quota. You didn't make it, you were beat. And the children work their parents, so if you didn't meet your quota, you and your kid would be beat. And so here, so torture positions, like stocks, they're held right there. So something like that, but just now they have to sit, which is, I guess, unbelievably painful. Here, a couple different whippings right here. This is from Uncle Tom's Cabin, but almost always for quota. In fact, they would check, when they would do sales, they would check the back. Potential slaves, look how many times they were beat. Did they meet their quota? If they were whipped a lot, they didn't meet their quota, not really work. Or, well, we'll get to it in a sec. And the whole thing operated on this terror. And don't forget, I can't emphasize this enough. So you're going to get slaveholders like Jefferson Davis, who will become the president of the Confederacy, claim, I never beat my slaves. What he really meant is, no, I didn't beat them for no reason. But if they didn't meet their quota, of course they got tortured. Of course. And so here's a couple more examples. The water torture was also quite common. Israel was doing this to prisoners in the 1980s. So they changed the term water torture. They started calling it waterboarding. You might have heard of that. So they wouldn't be violating international law, but it's just different versions of a horrific torture. Here, whipping. You might know what that is? He's a Union soldier, Simon Butler. Volunteered for the United States Army in 1863, right outside of New Orleans. And they do a quick cursory check, and the doctor could not believe his back. He's wearing the light blue pants of a Union soldier, and he saw his back. All these whipping. I can't even count. And you know what he was doing? I'm not going to meet in court. Go to hell. I'm not doing it. I'm fighting back. I don't know if I have that kind of bravery to fight back. But that's what he was doing. He was fighting back. So that takes more courage. No more courage than I would have, because I can't even imagine the hell he went through. That's why he did it. I will not meet your quota. There's lots of ways to fight back. Slaves always fight back, and that's one. So if you see that shoulder, so that picture and that soldier, sometimes they just show a kind of generic hell of slavery because it's such a interesting picture. No, that's a United States Army soldier fought for equality and to liberate or to unify the country. So another insidious measure of this new capitalistic system, that if you're going to have this quota system for field hands, there's going to be a real division of labor. So you're going to have household help and field hands. Field hands, household help. Which one are going to be treated worse? Household help, not as many. They're going to be living in the house, keeping care of, cleaning the house, taking care of the master's children, cooking their food. They're right there. Which one will be treated better? Less harsh punishment. Yeah, household. One, for a very obvious reason, they're in the household together. And they're also caring for their children. I think you can see why maybe you don't want too harsh a punishment. But there's something else. This insidious system that is developing will lead to another horrible facet. Who had lighter colored skin? Why did household help have lighter colored skin? Partially, but there's something else. More fundamental. Remember the fornication laws? The household help are all related to the master's family. Remember that? They're all related. It's happening to the field hands too, but it's happening here. So this torture is going on constantly. But they're treated a little better. And they have lighter colored skin. Just like Bacon's Rebellion, and after that, lighter colored skin, slave codes didn't quite apply, so that they'd be free. You're going to have this form of racism on the plantation. The plantation will be divided by color of skin too. So there's going to be a number of potential rebellions or people running away. And guess who told on them? It was almost always household slaves. They told, for example, they're the ones who told on Denmark Vesey. They're the ones who told on Nat Turner. They would tell all the time when slaves be planning on, other slaves planning on running away. This idea, well, I'm closer to you because I have lighter colored skin. It's all this hierarchy and how insidious it is going to be. And one more thing about slavery. When there's a series of slave narratives. The most famous would be done during the New Deal in the 1930s. They recorded former slaves who were in their 70s, 80s, and 90s. Amazing recording. It's kind of hard to hear. But they said, they're talking about how bad slavery was. And, so how the terrible things, the whipping, the beating, the quotas, the horrific food. Everybody was sick and had parasites. It was just awful. The thing they said was the worst was the lack of free will. That inability to decide your own fate. And that's why I put down for sale. I thought that was a good way to show this inability to control your own fate. That you're not in control of your own destiny. And so I kind of like this one from 1823, auction. As likely, Negroes, as likely was a very common, almost an adjective they would use. I don't know why, or adverb. I don't know why it was used. Here, selling a mother from a child, and all the time, or vice versa, all the time. By the way, that's civilizing them, I guess, to sell the child. That's civilizing. Here, it says, a likely healthy young Negro Lincoln, between 15 and 16. Valuable. Why? Couldn't they have about 4 or 5 children? The whole system was insidious, but you can't control your own fate. And it's just this continuous humiliation. Imagine the humiliation having to stand in front of everybody naked. He's not quite naked in that picture, but usually naked, poked and prodded and looked at like a hunk of meat. Just always humiliation. The humiliations just must have built up. And here, this is obviously melodramatic. Let's help the child from the baby, rarely be that young. Here is pretty common. This is a father sold from the family all the time. And for some reason, I mentioned this before, this is a slave auction in Charleston. They would put anybody from sub-Saharan Africa with turbans. They clearly had no idea who wore turbans. They just figured that's Africa, which no, it's much more complex. But the slave market, this is the domestic slave trade. The domestic slave trade involved hundreds of thousands of human beings. And this is one of these slave copies. And they're trying to draw it right in front of the United States Capitol. That's supposed to be the US Capitol. Just go with it. The rotunda had not been built yet. But this massive international trade. People got rich being the middleman. This is the Old Slave Market Museum in Charleston, South Carolina. And these are the prices of slaves. So here is an extra man, AKA not especially skilled laborer in 1860, about $1,500 to $1,600. This is 2007 value, 35 to 38,000. It's probably significantly more than that. It's hard to measure it. And really interesting museum now in the slave market. I took a walking tour, my wife and I took a walking tour of Charleston, South Carolina, and our guide was great. Great guide at first, really interesting. And then he started saying some interesting things. He started with, the North just didn't understand the way the South functioned. Slavery was perfectly fine. There was a special relationship. And when they started the Civil War, okay, this was 2009. Really? Okay. And I'm just not walking, oh my God. And he said, slavery really wasn't that bad. Oh, sure, the market was kind of rough, but it wasn't that bad. People didn't understand. It would have ended completely. Then he went on telling me how much he hated Abraham Lincoln. And he told me that $5 bills, to give someone a $5 bill to relatively recently in Charleston was an insult. You give someone a $5 bill, you've insulted them. Because it has Lincoln. So Lincoln was very much the villain. And so it got done and we're paying, and I was so happy that in my wallet I had $5 bills. I couldn't even begin to tell you. I had no idea. And I was just so happy. And he said, I knew you were one of them.
Oh my God.
I guess liking Lincoln. Okay, so part of this process would be to break the will of the slaves. Because if you're having a massive slave labor camp, and the term for a slave that had been broken was called a cuffie, or a really horrific term, but it's kind of lost some of its resonance because people don't know a sample. A cuffie, if you hit someone like the back of their hand, that's cuff. So they've been beaten into submission. A sambo was the term for this submissive slave. And then soon after the Civil War, it's submissive, almost always black man, who said yes sir, no sir, and acted the way slaves were supposed to act. And one thing, slaves were supposed to act inferior, dumb, the butt of the jokes, which once again, humiliation on top of humiliation. They were supposed to act that way. And if they don't act that way, they got to be broken. They're still uncivilized. And so that was a cuffie. And so Sambo would be used to talk about black men, God, well into the 1970s in the United States. It was really common for older people to call black men just all black men, older white people to call black men, or anybody of darker colored skin, just say, call him Sam. Sam, come here, Sam. And yeah, I heard my uncle say that to somebody once. I was like 7, Nebraska. I had no idea what that meant. It's one of those things, you can't pick who your relatives are. There's good ones and bad ones, right? That was Uncle Hap. So, here, there's the master shot. Acting submissive. But this is a way of passing resistance, too. This is a way to resist. Act submissive, and as soon as the back is turned, fight back. It could be little things, but little things mean something. It means you're still in the fight. It means you're still there. You're still a human. And so that's a cuffie. And yeah, it's not used as much. Has anyone ever heard either of these terms? Sambo was much more commonly used. It's pretty, it used to be, it was a way to make fun of black people after the Civil War as a way to degrade them. So for example, here's a cartoon, and this is from the 1890s, but it's using this term Sambo, and this horrifically racist caricature of a black man. And it's supposed to look subhuman. It's horrific. And it's used, it's still used. And watermelon, he's saying, say Sambo, generic, you're black yourself. Which, how humiliating. Don't you think the price of watermelon, don't you think the slice of watermelon is rather large? It says, golly boss, subservient, that's what we're supposed to act. Golly boss, they ain't half big enough. Ha ha, that's supposed to be funny. So laughing at somebody. So that's where the term comes from. And that's where you get racial slurs. Racial slurs, or even these kind of ethnic stereotyping slurs, are a measure of control. You have one group, the group on top. Because they're on top, they feel they have the right to attack other people, to give them this, please have the right word, stereotype. You're this, so you have this stereotype. So this is Irish. And they have all kinds of racial slurs for Irish. Remember I told you, in this era is where they start dividing people up by races. And Irish are going to be considered a different race than British, which is mind-boggling, but they would. And a couple things about this. That allows you to classify them by groups. Not by who they are, but by their religion, their color of skin, and their class, rich or poor, their ethnic nationality. You can come up with all kinds of classifications. And therefore, once you start dividing people up groups, you're dividing people up by groups, you start making that hierarchy. And boy, if you can say this term, that implies you're on top. And if you don't have much, that gives you a little bit of power. I got something over somebody else. I can say these things. And it becomes almost subconscious. You don't even think about it. It just comes out. It's amazing how many times in my life, and I bet some of you have heard these kind of horrific racial slurs. And then people just say it without even thinking about it. because it's just this kind of insidious racism becomes normalized. But the big thing is, it's power. It gives you a little bit of status. I can feel on top. And there's something else to it. If there's a little bit of a taboo and you say it, you think you got away with something. That gives you even more power. That should also tell you that people who say that are generally people who, in reality, think they're powerless. They're probably cowards. And so that also makes them pretty scary. In my long history of dealing with people like this, I've been teaching here since 1920. So you're leaving already?
Early to go to that.
Huh?
Right.
I'll see you. Last thing. This is the worst. So this is from a bank ad. And this term was for the most uncivilized, the most dangerous, the most savage person on the plantation. That term came about here. Now they're using it almost like the term Sambo here. But that's where that term comes from. And that is the most, has the strongest legacy from slavery. And that's also why people who, especially people who are not descendant or potentially descendant of slaves in this era, if they use this, it is the most derogatory. Also tells you the most about the people using this term. But this implies that they are the most dangerous, this term. And so that's the most uncivilized, the most savage. This is a really horrific term. By the way, this is from a little bank. They used to make these little mechanical banks. You turn a little crank, and it would have a hand. I've seen one with like a cat. And you put the paw and the paw, and turn the crank, and the paw goes up and puts the coin into the mouth. It's a bank. Here, that's a bank. So I was in an antique store kind of thing in New Orleans, and they had that for sale as an antique. That very bank. Well, let me rephrase. I'm pretty sure it was the same one. And it's one we were just so taken aback. But there's so many. These old toys were so racist. I wish I would have taken a picture of it, but it was like, this is like 15 years ago. It was like $500. Hey, would you guys like some homework?
Not really.
Let me ask you again. Would you like some homework?
Yes.
I forgot to put this on the board. I just told the other class. All right, everybody. Homework. 6:30 to 6:47 for Thursday. Finish chapter 14. Oh, you know what you guys really want to do? What month is it, people? It's actually Festivus. You guys know what Festivus is?